Hi, everyone. My name is Melissa Marquez Rodriguez. I'm a mobile engineering lead at Square, specifically within the Cash to App Taxes mobile department. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the past, the present, and future of Android engineering roles. This talk is primarily a kind of a bird's eye view of how Android engineering roles have evolved over the years in terms of the community, in terms of the technology, in terms of companies and how they think about it. And it's exactly what the title is. We'll go through the past, we'll go to the present, and we'll predictions around the future. So let's get started. First of all, a little bit about my bio, especially on the Android world. So I started in 2010 partnering with Google as part of the University of Puerto Rico at Maya West. I was a student there and I led the EEEE Computer Society. And we partnered with Google to teach Android to computer engineering students as an effort to kind of grow the community and kind of introduce folks to something new other than like what computers teach in. 2014, I decided to join a company called Weebly as the second Android engineer. In this role, I kind of helped develop a website editor on Android with just a team of two and kind of grow the app to almost 100% parity. In 2016, I officially became the tech lead. And then in 2018, I joined Square. Weebly got acquired by Square as a new brand, Square Online. And at that point, I became an engineering manager, also for the same Android team. But this time, our focus was a little different. It was integrating online store functionality into Square point of sale systems. And then in 2020, I joined the Cash App Taxes mobile engineering lead. At this point, I started leading both iOS and Android. All this to say is that I've been throughout the block on Android. I've been a volunteer, I've been an IC, I've been a tech lead, I've been an engineering manager, and now I'm even leading iOS and Android as mobile system as a whole. So let's continue. So think about this for a little bit. 10 years ago, dedicated Android roles didn't exist. Like, Android came out in 2009, and we really didn't start taking it seriously until like 2011, 2012. Like, the fact that sometimes we come into these presentations to start talking and say, hey, you know, what is a senior Android role? What do you need to learn? What are all these things? All of this evolves so quickly and so fast that like you didn't know. You blink and you missed it. But let's continue. Next up, we're going to talk a little bit about the past. And I've divided this into 4 eras. Era number 1, I call it the early days. It was 2019, 2011. The first Android phone comes in. The app ecosystem was still in its infancy. Many companies wouldn't take Android seriously. A lot of folks were like, Apple and iOS, it wasn't even called iOS back then, is the future. Why should we take this tiny open source thing super seriously? And then most of the developers of these times were former Java developers. The next era is what I call the worldwide growth. It's an era that happened between like 2011 to 2014. And in here, a few big milestones happen. Android becomes the #1 phone OS in the world. Essentially, it has reached penetration across all devices. Samsung becomes the top dominant phone after iPhone. Android 4.0 comes out. This was a significant stability boost, and it changed the way people perceive Android from being this gimmicky, buggy software to something that was definitely much more stable than what it was in the early days. We started expanding into tablet sizes. So now we're just working outside of our comfort zone with just phones. At this point, companies are like, maybe we should take this Android thing a little bit seriously. And so we started to develop, Android app counterparts to their iPhone and iOS counterparts. In terms of like developers itself, most of them were contractors. were like, hey, we need an Android developer. Can you come join? There was still a sentiment of like, here's the iPhone app, copy it, and there we go. And then that's kind of this era. The next era, I call it the material and beyond. This is around 2015 to 2017. Some of the major significant things that happened around this time, Google introduces material design. This kind of revolutionized how people saw Android, especially the designs and the apps as a whole, because most of these apps were, before them, they were gimmicky, they didn't look that great, or they were just carbon copies of their iOS counterparts. At this point, Android apps, kind of all of them developed their own sense of identity. They all have the material kind of guidelines. Everyone was kind of following it at the time. And then in the company side, we started to recognize that Android needed fully fit teams. Like, you weren't going to succeed at this point. As an example of this, my company, Square, at this point, we launched a appointments product on iOS first. And surprisingly, the #1 feature request for 6 months wasn't, X and Y feature. It was like, why is there an Android device? And companies at this point is when they are like, yes, we need to have these fully staffed teams. Obviously, there's other companies who had this beforehand. These are all estimations, but this is kind of a general guideline. Second, Android expands to a lot of more platforms at this point. This is when Android TV gets introduced, Apple Auto gets introduced, Wear OS gets introduced. So Android is essentially everywhere. Another big thing of apps at this point is that monetization starts to happen for a lot of them. No longer is like the freebie app. People and developers and product managers start taking this seriously, and they're like, hey, you should monetize your apps. And finally, also many major open source libraries explode this time. Many of the Jake Wharton libraries, support libraries, the design libraries, the early phases of RxJava, retrofit, a lot of these, this is when this era kind of happened, and this lasted for like 2 to 3 years. The next era, something I like to call the stack revolution. And this is primarily because a lot of changes happened to the technology stack. And the main three that I like to always call out was the adoption of Kotlin as a first-class citizen by Google in 2017, the popularity boom of reactor programming with RxJava and coroutines, and then finally, Google taking the stance and creating Jetpack libraries and giving an opinionated look of how apps should be built. Before this, Google never gave an opinionated look, and developers were fended off trying to do their own thing, resulting in many different types of code base. On the design side, iOS and Android apps start to look really similar. Companies at this point are decided, hey, why don't we combine a lot of the elements and kind of create our own design and unique look? Google continued with material design. Facebook, for example, unified a lot of them. Uber looks almost the same on both platforms. So parity between the platforms kind of start to become a thing. And companies fully recognize Android as an essential piece of their business. Like, they need an Android counterpart. Very rarely now you can launch with like an iOS app. And if you don't get an Android app quickly, you're definitely going to lose at the market. And then finally, the term senior Android developer becomes a thing. Like, at this point, 5+ years since 2011, let's put it a good number, people have been developing Android apps. I was hiring around this point, and hiring someone with 3+ years of experience around this time is extremely hard, because at this point, very few people were there, and they were all coveted. But at the same time, Android developer could be someone's first job. Like, at this point, you have new hires who all they've done is Android development, because they've been in college while Android was a thing. And so they can become Android developers at this time. So overall, this idea and this timeline is just to give you an idea that like Android is molding and changing all the time. It is never unique. It is never the same. And we shouldn't take that for granted because it will change. One sec. Okay, perfect. All right, so the present. What do you need to be an Android developer nowadays? I kind of developed this into like two different skills, the general skills and the technical skills. In terms of the general skills, some of the ones I promote are learn to read about Android development legacy. You know, Android as a whole has just changed so drastically, and you're going to find these super interesting code bases that are ever changing. They're never going to be the same, and they have a little bit of everything. You know, they have RxJava, they have coroutines, they even have async tasks if they haven't been updated in forever. The other one is backwards compatibility. Backwards compatibility is a key tenet of any mobile app. So I definitely encourage everyone to kind of learn about this. Every time I onboard someone to Android, they struggle, especially web developers who become Android developers. They struggle understanding this concept of there's a tail of app versions. There's a, you need to support really old versions of Android to even be relevant in the market. Embrace that everything doesn't originate from Google. A naive approach when you're learning Android for the first time is, hey, Google has all these things, I'm going to learn from that. And while that's a great starting point, a lot of new technologies don't necessarily come from Google, especially in olden days. This wasn't a thing. And Google has decided to adopt some of them as part of their core stack. For example, Retrofit, a great library that Square created, Google embraces it right as like, this is the alternative, use it. We're not going to build one. And so definitely recommend these. And that kind of brings to my other point. Open source is significant in the open world and the Android world. There's a lot of open source in here. You can find a lot of libraries, a lot of things. People are actively contributing. And there's companies who really want open source to be part of their DNA. You know, companies like Square or Uber or Pinterest, they all have different libraries that are super interested and everyone uses. And you should not shy away from the open source world. Last two are kind of more general things. First one, don't get frustrated when something doesn't make sense. There's a lot of that in Android world. There's a lot of outdated documentation that has not been touched in years. There's a lot of design patterns that were designed 10 years ago, and we didn't know where everything was going to go. Samples, fragments, activities, life cycles, they're not great, but doesn't mean you cannot work around them. And then finally, when you're working on Android, try not to compare yourself too harshly to other platforms like iOS or the web. Everyone has their own different skill sets and has different needs. And so don't force yourself on that end. On the next side, technical stuff. What are some of the technical stuff that in the present developers and managers are kind of looking for? Obvious one, Kotlin. That's like #1 development language. Everything in Google is that way. Most open source libraries are being migrated to Kotlin. Most of the innovation around like reactive paradigms, aka coroutines, is coming from Kotlin. So don't shy away from it. Second, reactive programming paradigms. Controlling your views, making your presenters or your view models talk to each other has always been one of the top problems. And it is kind of widely known that nowadays, coroutines, RxJava are kind of some of the solved things you can do for this. So I definitely recommend you use them. Common open source libraries. This is your arsenal of tools. This is the tools that you should be able to use in response whenever you're building something. Retrofit, Jetpack, Picasso, Lodi, Dagger, all of these are open source. All of these are being developed in the open. You should at least have a basic understanding of what they are, what they do, even if you don't use them. Finally, kind of the revolution in UI. I think a lot of people would agree. Declarative UI is probably the next paradigm that's going to happen. In this case, you can include things like Jetpack Compose, but these paradigms have been tried to be developed many, many times before. Static view methods to generate specific views. But now we finally have the technology and the language, aka Kotlin, to be able to build something that is pretty cool. And I think this is going to take us to the next level and kind of change how we develop our apps and our architectures in the future. Server-driven configurations. More and more, I'm seeing a lot of apps who everything lives on the server. We don't need the client. Partially, sometimes server-driven UI. Partially, it's like dynamic configurations. Of course, this is always dynamic and it changes drastically depending on the type of app. Obviously, like, apps with like a map are very different than like an app that just has a tons of forms. And finally, dependency injection. I think this is a key tenet of separating concerns on Android apps, and libraries like Dagger or Coin or all of these, learn how to use them, learn what the differences are between them. You are going to see them everywhere for a reason. They help clean your code and make your code more testable. All right. So what if I'm brand new to Android? I've seen this also as a thing. Like, this is a lot, Melissa. I'm overwhelmed. I don't know where to start. So for that, I recommend 2 things. First one, focus on the fundamentals. Fun story, my dad's a coach, and I always say this I believe this is true for anything, including Android and software development. So the story goes, my dad used to coach basketball students, and they were trying to copy basically NBA stars as freshmen in high school. And, what he told them was, hey, I don't care what the NBA do. You're not at the level. If you cannot master the fundamentals of whatever you're doing, you won't be able to succeed. And I think the same thing applies for Android. If you don't learn the basics of like, what's an activity, how do you communicate, how do you display on a screen, I think those are key components that you should definitely learn first before you start diving into these super high gens, like specialty libraries for really specific problems. And then the second thing I always say to people who are starting is find companies that can accommodate your growth. It is not the same joining a company like one of the big tech companies that have hundreds of Android engineers like Square or Uber or Google, that they can accommodate people who are just learning, who are just starting, and can find space within their teams, versus starting a small company, which has 4 engineers and they expect to do full stack Android engineer from the CI/CD all the way to platform, all the way to product development. And so that's a different mindset. That's a different requirement. If you have specialties, I also recommend you take a look at that. If you, for example, I saw in the last talk, someone mentioned about firmware. Why don't you join a company who specializes in creating specific Android software that, for IC devices, like, for example, a lot of point of sales nowadays are all built on top of Android. Even if you go to airplanes, a lot of the monitors are built on Android. This is a great way to use some of your existing skills and start learning about Android and kind of be able to bridge the gap before both. So that are kind of my key advice for people who are starting out. So a little bit about reflections of the future. What is the future? Where are we going? What do I think is going to be the next big thing? While I cannot predict exactly what's going to be, I can make an educated guess of what they are. And here they are. The first one, the Android operating system is not going away. I think building an operating system from scratch is hard. You can ask anyone. And the fact that Android's open source, the fact that people can use it to build a lot of specific things in a lot of different devices is a huge benefit. It might evolve, it might change. Libraries and the way we built on it is going to change, but the operating system is probably not going away for any time soon. The second one, business domains will matter even more. And why is this important? I think we've reached a point where mobile devices are not the hottest and latest thing that we have in the business. And you will hear this in in the Twitterverse, be like, Shopify is moving to React Native because, we are just building a bunch of forms. And so domains matter. For example, if you're working on Uber, that's something you cannot do without a device because you need the location, you need the sensors. If you're building something like, I don't know, a Groupon, which is just a list of things and you click a lot of things, well, there's certain device things that you need. A lot of this could be a web form or a web page. So business domains matter and they will get more specific. Lastly, cross-platform integrations will continue to grow. Going to my same point of the web and iOS and how are these things are going to evolve, I think things like React Native, WebViews, Kotlin, multi-platform, for example, are going to be here and they're not going to go away. And I believe there's a space for them in all these companies. Obviously, you should use them judiciously and you should not just jump to them immediately. But I think it's definitely something you should definitely consider when building these things and not be scared of it. Don't be a purist about, hey, we're just going to do Android. You can integrate with the Android operating system. Developing code is something completely different. Lastly, Android hardware integrations will continue to expand. Based on my first point of the operating system is not going away, I think, you could look at the right, that is the Square Register. That device is entirely built on Android and Square has invested millions of dollars in it. It's not going away. I think that is the magic of having an open source library, is the ability to be able to keep building things. And then lastly, the development stack will continue to change. I just mentioned about declarative UIs a minute ago. That's going to change how we do everything. And I'm not here to predict the exact trends of what it's going to have, but you need to be open-minded and you need to keep up to date a little bit. Read Twitter, read something, go to some of these events. I think that's key in the Android world as it evolves so quickly, and a lot of it is on the open source world. So I definitely encourage everyone to take a look at these things and kind of continue moving. And I think that is it. So thanks. Plug for my company, Square. We're hiring, as I mentioned before. We have at least 8 mobile apps and we do hardware. So you're all welcome to join. So thank you. And I guess I'll take some Q&As now.
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, we've got one question that's popped up here, so I'll let you take that right away, okay?
Okay. All right, hello. One question. You said not to depend on everything that Google shows up, like activities, fragments, like cycles, and I agree, but I'm not sure where to start or what to take as an example for things. Okay, that is a great question. That is true. I said a little bit of a contradiction here. I said, start with the fundamentals, but don't believe everything Google says. My recommendation is, on that case, oh, it disappeared. My recommendation on that case is, yes, learn the basics of try the code, the Code Labs on Google. See what you can get a little bit about that. So get a basic understanding of how Android apps in general are built. But then when you're using it in your like production or you're using it for interviewing, don't immediately jump to like everything. There's alternatives. And what I'm trying to get is keep an open mind and look at other alternatives that might be outside of Google's scope. All right, next question. What's your opinion about learning things you never use or never had to use them, or they're asked in interviews? In my case, RX, for example, I just have basic experience. Unfortunately, yes, a lot of these are kind of needed and they're kind of expected. I definitely recommend you take some time to do a little bit of a sample app. As a hiring manager myself, I don't expect you to be a expert on these things. I'm not going to go into an interview and say like, if I have an observable with this edge case and this edge case, how do you resolve that? I think what you should achieve to learning some of these basics is do a sample app, learn the basics, learn what it does, how it works, and why are we using it. A lot of times that's kind of like the basic questions around these. And on take homes, you definitely also have a little bit of an opportunity to use a lot of these technologies. So I definitely recommend it. All right, any other questions? Let me check the chat just in case. Oh, table chat. Okay, cool.